Homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Today we're looking at the importance of hearing true Dhamma, Sadhamma Savanam. As you know, we've been examining the Avijjā Sutta in Anguttara Nikāya, chapter 10, discourse number 61. And so far we've looked at the insight pathway on how we develop ignorance, how we perpetuate ignorance. And on the wholesome side, it leads to true knowledge and liberation. And we've taken that a little slower by looking at the first link, which was associating with good people. And now we're looking at the second link in that pathway, which is hearing true Dhamma. So we're going to define what true Dhamma is and look at the state of the availability of true Dhamma and some of the blocks towards hearing true Dhamma as well. If you recall, the Buddha says that in order to develop true knowledge and liberation, you start with associating with good people. So these are noble ones, people walking the Noble Eightfold Path, people with good qualities, who keep virtue and who are grateful and thankful and don't cultivate defilements. So what that leads to in this insight pathway is hearing the true Dhamma. And from hearing the true Dhamma, which we're looking at today, it leads to conviction or saddha. And from there it leads to wise contemplation, which is yoniso manasikara. And that leads to mindfulness and clear comprehension, which is sati sampajanya. And that leads to indriya samvara, which is the restraint of sense faculties. And that in turn leads to three kinds of good conduct. And then eventually that leads to the four establishments of mindfulness, so the satipatthana, and then the seven factors of enlightenment, the bojjhangas, and finally we cultivate true knowledge and liberation. So we've been slowly going down this insight pathway to see what leads to what conditions what. So the one that we're focusing on today is Sadhamma Savanam, hearing true Dhamma. And we're going to also look at this link between associating with good people and how it leads to hearing true Dhamma, because that's very, very important. If we don't understand that we hear true Dhamma from the Aryas and from the Buddha and the noble ones, the noble arahants, then it's very difficult to ensure that we're cultivating true knowledge and liberation. As we know, if we listen to the wrong Dhamma, it leads to the wrong path and practice and different kinds of attainments, but not necessarily the ones that lead us out of samsara. What's useful is to examine the distinction between asadhamma and sadhamma. So asadhamma savanam in the Avijjā Sutta, the Buddha says that this leads to developing more ignorance, whereas sadhamma savanam, hearing true Dhamma, leads to developing true knowledge and liberation. So one is very good and one is quite bad. So when it comes to asadhamma, which leads to more ignorance, this is normally associated with musa. We remember musa from musavada when we take the 5 precepts. Musavada being lies, telling falsehoods, cultivating false speech. So musa is on the side of falsity. And musadhamma is also another word that's used, which is things that are deceptive in nature. And so what you get from that is things on the side of falsity, falsehoods, lies, deception. And on sadhamma side, the true Dhamma, the true teachings, what you get is saccang, the truth. Amosadhamma, so non-deceptive. Ariya Dhamma, the noble teaching. And so you get truth, what's real, the reality of things, things which are not deceptive. And so that's very important to know the distinction between the two. So when you look at it like this, you realize that most of what we do in samsara is actually associated with the falsity. And this is on the ariya path. So when we walk the Noble Eightfold Path in an ariya sense, so we look at this from the supramundane perspective, not the mundane perspective, but the one that we really want to get out of this samsaric existence, get out of the transmigration through birth after birth, then you realize that a lot of what we watch on the television, what we hear on the radio, or what we see through the internet, there's a lot of programming, content, which is very deceptive towards the ariya path, the noble path, the path that the Buddha and the noble arahants have walked, and which those that are keen on getting out of samsara are walking as well. And what is really true is what the Buddha teaches, because it's always reminding you the right view, always yatha bhuta jnana dasanam. So seeing things as they really are. What is the true reality? What is the truth? Whereas what is in a very samsaric sense, it's always deceiving us. And so it's very good to look at a few examples around this. Before we go into some examples, it's good to actually have a look at this Dhātuvibhaṅga Sutta, because this kind of resonates when you look at asadhamma, sadhamma, and how it links with musa mosadhamma versus saccang, the actual truth. So in the Dhātuvibhaṅga Sutta, which is looking at the elements, the Buddha gives this particular statement about truth. And he says, his deliverance being founded upon truth is unshakable for bhikkhu. What is false, which has a deceptive nature, and what is true, which has an undeceptive nature, Nibbāna. Therefore, a bhikkhu possessing this truth possesses the supreme determination for truth, so that's saccaditthana. For this bhikkhu is the supreme noble truth, namely Nibbāna, which has an undeceptive nature. So this is what really resonates. We're always looking for what is founded on truth, not what is deceptive. So in Pali it's Musa yang mosadhammang, tang saccang yang amosadhammang Nibbānang. So Nibbana is the one that is truth. What leads to Nibbana, the teachings of the Buddha, is always around truth. It's undeceptive. It's noble. But everything else, and literally it could mean everything else outside of the Buddha's teaching, is false, because it has that deceptive nature. It's lying to us. It tricks us to come back again into samsara. And so that's where the danger is. And this is very much in the ariya sense, that you don't want to be duped again. And so when you think about truth, you understand from the Noble Eightfold Path, which is the way out to the cessation of suffering, you remember that the Noble Eightfold Path starts with the right view. And in the Mahavedala Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya, discourse number 43, Venerable Sariputta says there are two conditions for the arising of right view. And we've been through this in our examination of Yoniso Manasikara, wise contemplation. And what he says is the first condition is words of another, parato goso, and the second is wise contemplation, Yoniso Manasikara. These are the two conditions for the arising of right view. So when you link parato goso, hearing the words of another, with hearing true Dhamma, then they're linked. What you want to hear is this true Dhamma. You want to hear the Buddha's words. You want to hear the words of the noble arahants, those that have completed the path. And anyone who is actually helping to explain that, helping to convey that, to remind you of the Buddha's wise words and those of the noble arahants. Then you know you're on the right path, because you're beginning with right view. So if we look at some examples of sadhamma, like true Dhamma, and we look at some examples of asadhamma, the wrong Dhamma, and remember this is from the ariya perspective. So we're not looking at it through the lens of everyday mundane life, everyday relative truths. We're looking at it from what the Buddha calls sadhamma, like true Dhamma. So when you look at this distinction, just bear that in mind so you don't misapprehend that, oh, that's not true, how could that be? So under the examples of wrong Dhamma, we have fake Buddha quotes, we have mixed up teachings, so blended teachings, so some of what the Buddha taught and some of something else. We have teachings based on eternalism, which is what Buddha has always said in the suttas. Don't fall into the wrong views associated with eternalism. Then you have teachings based on annihilism. Buddha says don't fall into those teachings either. Then you have things like science. And this includes both modern and traditional science, mainstream media, psychic predictions, conspiracy theories, and then things associated with gain, honor, popularity, politics. And there's many, many more you can add to that. And from the Noble Ariya perspective, so those walking the Noble Eightfold Path, cultivating the supramundane path, wanting to get out of samsara, all these things you would put on the side of asadhamma, because they prevent you, they block you from the real truth, the reality of things as they really are. And we're going to look at some specific examples of that. And then on the side of sadhamma, true Dhamma, the true teachings, then you have everything that the Buddha taught. Things like the Four Noble Truths, of which the Noble Eightfold Path is part of that. The Bojjhangas, the 7 enlightenment factors. The 5 spiritual faculties, the 5 powers. The 4 bases of spiritual power, the 4 right striving. The 4 establishments of mindfulness, the mental absorptions, the 3 characteristics. So those are some examples, but you can see they're very steeped in the foundations of what the Buddha has taught and what he's asked us to cultivate in order to get out of samsara. So the path leading to true knowledge and liberation, Nibbana ultimately. So when you look at this, some people might say, oh, but how can you put science? There's truth in science. How can you put mainstream media in there? There are things that are truth there. How can you, there's lots of questions that arise from that. And so let me explain a little bit about why satya, truth versus musa, lies, falsity. What's the distinction in how we practice? So let's take the example of, examining the first noble truth of suffering. So the last poya we went through, what is this first noble truth? We deep dived into that and we looked at all the things associated with the first noble truth. So you get 12 or 13 statements from the Buddha. Birth is suffering, old age is suffering, sickness is suffering, death is suffering, sorrow, lamentation, sadness and pain and despair is suffering, separation from what is liked is suffering, union with what is displeasing is suffering, not getting what we want is suffering, and then, in short, the 5 aggregates that we cling to is suffering. So when we looked at that, and say for example we meditate on birth is suffering, aging is suffering, sickness is suffering, and death is suffering. So we meditate on that. We say with birth it leads to old age, it leads to sickness, it leads to death. This is our big picture. This is our universal predicament in all different births, that we keep going through this cycle of samsara. And so if we take the first one, aging, and so when we meditate we see the truth. And we say, okay, this body is of the nature to age. And we accept that. We accept the grey hair, we accept the wrinkles, we accept how the body starts to decline day by day. When we're young, we don't notice it so much. But if we observe our elders, our loved ones who are, older than us, we see it more apparently. Or if we are older, then we look at ourselves and we say, oh, the faculties are not so good, so on and so forth. So in our meditation, we've seen it. We know that it is a truth. And so we accept that, what the Buddha says is true. But then when we turn on the television and we look at some type of programming that's on, it's an advertisement. Or we look at social media like our Instagram feed or our Facebook feed and there's an advertisement. Or an influencer trying to tell us something about a product. So we're looking at these different forms of media. And this advertisement comes on and it talks about collagen serum. And it says, oh, I've used this product. And it shows a before picture and it shows an after picture. and there's this person there that you've been watching or looking at, or you have some sort of idea about, and maybe you've listened to before, and they tell you, this has really worked for me. That when I use this collagen serum, it's fantastic. It's anti-aging. I swear by it. And, you know, all the types of things that one would say that, yeah, I've been using it for a while and I vouch for it. Now, if you believe this person, or you believe the type of ad that is being shown towards you, then this is how you replace what you meditated on as jara pi dukkha, that aging is dukkha, that the reality is that we have the nature to age. And you replace it with this person's words. And at that point, the truth now becomes musa. So you've listened to some kind of wrong Dhamma and it's replaced what you believed. And so if you go out and buy that cream, then there must be some sort of buy-in to that. So remember, this is not about whether you actually go out and buy it or not. That's not the point. So one might actually still buy these things. But it's important to see what happens when we keep replacing truth with falsity. Because the ultimate truth is really telling us that no matter how many creams we use, how many serums we use, and remember, collagen serum is now the replacement for oil of yule. So what our grandparents used to use back in the day used to be things like creams, oil of yule, or cream of yule, or whatever it used to be called, is now anti-aging collagen treatment. So there's a continual thing when we listen to the programming, because this is what is on television, what is on the internet, what is on, you know, the news, what is on many things. If we take that further and look at books, you go to the library, or you go to, you know, one of these online stores, or you actually physically go into a bookstore, and you go into the health area, and you see these book titles like Growing Younger, Age Later, How to Stay Young, and these are true titles of books. Now, if you believe any of that, if you buy into that, whether you buy the book or not, there is something that is trying to replace the truth with musa, with the lie. And as we know, aging is real. If we take sickness, for example, vyādi dukkha, we are of the nature to sicken, is what we do as a frequent contemplation, what the Buddha recommends. Again, if use that example of going into a bookstore, and you look at some of the book titles, and it says, Forever Young. That's one book title. Super Immunity, Good Health, Good Life. There's even one that says Perfect Health. So there are things there that are always trying to replace what we do in our meditation as truth, and what we come out and then maybe take on and replace the truth with a falsity. So right now, in terms of even medicine, there are times where we think antibiotics are supreme, they reign supreme, and this is the example that helps you to see about science. So there is that sliding scale between ultimate truth, so truth that the Buddha tells us and is teaching us, and for us to know for ourselves, all the way down to real, true lies. And in that sliding scale, you have relative truths, and science, to a certain extent, is somewhere in that sliding scale. So modern science, for example, has developed things like antibiotics, and there's a really good place for that, because it prevents us from really deteriorating when we get quite sick. But then you hear about superbugs, and so these are bugs that are resistant now to these wonderful antibiotics that we used to take, and which now if we take sometimes don't work. And so this is the nature of even science and medicine, that there are times where it gets superseded, that even Mother Nature overcomes that. So in that sense, when you think about sickness, there are temporary band-aids, there are temporary helps. You know, we can take vaccines, we can take Panadol, we can take even traditional medicine, so things like traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurveda, all these things work for a period of time, but they don't completely save us, because if they did, then we wouldn't die. But that's the thing, it's really important when we navigate the world that we're not replacing the truth, the ariya truth, the noble truth, with lies, with deception, with things that are going to ultimately crumble. They have a crumbling nature to them. And so when we look at death, we contemplate maranampi dukkhang. Death is dukkha, death is suffering. And we know that we are of the nature to die. I don't know anyone that can overcome that. And again, you go to the bookshelf and there are books that are selling that have titles that say, How Not to Die. And you look at it and you think, how incredible to have such a title. The Art of Living, The Denial of Death, that's another book title. The Longevity Paradox. I mean, all these things that if you really keep searching, and I think that's the reason why you have all these books and you have all these programs, that documentaries and even movies and TV programs that twist the truth, twist your perspective so you don't see how things really are. And when you listen to them, you know, this foolish talk is what Buddha talks about, what he names it as, then you get duped and you remain longer in ignorance. And so Buddha's always emphasizing how not to do that. And so really Buddha actually says, don't listen to the unwise ones, the ones that are not cultivating the path, the ones that don't have path and fruit, the ones that aren't the Buddha and the Noble Arahants, who haven't completely finished the task. Don't listen to those people. Listen to the Buddha, listen to the Noble Arahants, listen to the people that are cultivating the right path and practice. Don't get programmed in the wrong way. It's all programming, conditioning. And so that's the thing that we ask when we look at this particular part to this insight pathway. You know, the importance of hearing true Dhamma is, are we really hearing it correctly? Are we really seeing it correctly when we look at all these different forms of media? And when we meditate and really see, do we guard that, not flip it time and time again from what we see in meditation to something that is an untruth, something that is deceiving us and obliterating in many ways what we've seen in our meditation? There's this lovely story in the Dhammapada, number 60, and the Buddha utters this verse in reference to Saddhamma. And I won't go into too much detail with this story, maybe record it another time, but there was this young man who had a very beautiful wife, and a king coveted his wife, and so he gave some challenges. And his intent was quite nefarious because he wanted this young man's wife. So he sent this young man on some challenges, and so the young man went off and toiled and was very weary, but he had some very good qualities. And so he managed to actually meet those challenges. But at the end, he was still blocked by the king, and the king got quite agitated and unsettled because of these challenges and doing something so wrong. So they both ended up seeing the Buddha. And this is how the Buddha uttered this verse. Long is the night for the wakeful, long is the journey's length for the weary, long is the round of rebirths for fools who do not understand the true Dhamma. And so with this particular teaching, it was quite specific to coveting another person's, partner, whether it's husband or wife. But in this instance, it was coveting this young man's wife. And so long is the night for the wakeful. So that was reference to the king, because he was so unsettled and agitated that he couldn't sleep, worrying about this young man and whether he would meet the challenges, and longing for this young man's wife. And then the second line was, long is the journey's length for the weary. And it was about this young man going, to actually try and meet those challenges. I think it was to get this particular flower, which was very, very difficult to get. It was guarded by some deities and spirits. And right at the end, he was blocked. And so he was very, very tired from toiling, trying to get to where that flower was and then to return in time. And so the Buddha's last two lines is, long is the round of rebirths for fools who do not understand true Dhamma. So the king in many ways is a representation of the fool, because he cultivates the misconduct, coveting someone else's wife, doing evil things in order to gain that person's wife, to get the person out of the way in order to have the wife. And then not understanding true Dhamma, you get blocked, because when you cultivate such things, you actually are going down the path of the deception. You don't understand that when you cultivate these things, it's so unwholesome, it blocks your path. And so you don't understand why sexual misconduct, for example, is so bad in this very instance. But when you're around someone who's not a fool, like the Buddha, the ultimate wise person, then he would tell you, don't cultivate such actions. That path leads you to more suffering, more weariness, more agitation and unsettledness, if not torment and torture if you're reborn in a lower realm. And so he's always emphasizing to hear the true Dhamma. And Buddha says in another sutta, the Sabbi Sutta, in Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 1, discourse number 31, one should associate only with the good. With the good one should foster intimacy. Having learnt true Dhamma of the good, one is released from suffering. So this is the link to sappurisa sevana, that if you associate with good people, the noble ones, if you have no one but you have the Buddha's words, you have the words of the noble arahants, this is good, because you want to befriend these words, this good company. You want to befriend those that are walking the Noble Eightfold Path, those that have path and fruit, because they would always encourage you in the good things. They would always make sure you're on the right path and practicing the Noble Eightfold Path, not the wrong one. They would also ensure that you develop path and fruit, that if you haven't entered the stream, they would encourage you. That once you've entered the stream, they would say, develop more, develop further. Don't wait. They would give their sense of urgency. And so you can see why this would lead to true knowledge and liberation, because the encouragement is there. And if you have access to the noble arahants, then really lean on that. It only takes one arahant to get you to the truth and to block out, to guard yourself from all these wrong things, that every time you turn on the television, every time you read something that is not in line with the Buddha's teaching, which makes it vague, which makes it difficult to understand, which is on the side of samsara, that you're very cautious around it. That sometimes we need to listen and watch something in order to find out what's going on, particularly during these difficult times. We need to know whether there's restrictions or other types of things, or whether there are shortages, or generally what's happening. But we don't need to know more than that. And so if you have certain things on 24 hours a day, or even for any period of time where you're listening to something that is quite diluted, then one needs to know that that's what you're feeding into your mind. Sometimes we think we need something to play in the background or to watch because it makes us feel better. But when you know that what we think makes us feel better in an ultimate sense is really cultivating more ignorance, then you're more cautious around it, because you're replacing what you do in meditation with something that is false. And if you believe what is false, it's not good. So people think it's very morose to actually keep contemplating dukkha, but those that contemplate dukkha, the First Noble Truth, correctly, they get a lot of sense of relief, they get a lot of deep abiding, they actually are with the right view, they cultivate the wisdom, they get more saddha, more conviction towards the path. But if you keep thinking, I need to make myself happy, I need to patch it up, I think I can fix this, if I just patch it up in this way, then you meet a lot of unhappiness because it keeps going up and down, up and down, up and down. You need to keep fueling that more. And so it's important not to listen to those words that tell you to keep doing that. It's better to be with the truth than with the untruth. And we come back to this Avijjā Sutta, which basically says, knowledge is the best of things that rise up, ignorance excels amongst things that fall down, the Sangha is the best of things that go forth, and the most excellent of speakers is the Buddha. And that's really true. The Buddha is the most excellent of speakers. If you spend time with his words, you know how precise they are, how much instruction he's giving in his words, even what remains of the Buddha Dhamma now. And the Sangha is always the 4 pairs, the 8 kinds of noble beings, those that have path and fruit. So this is a reminder to be very cautious where we get our Dhamma from. And when we go to the Itivuttaka, discourse number 104, this is what Kujuttara Upasika remembers. The Buddha has said, for those who are knowledgeable, this is a state making for joy. Living the life of Dhamma under the Noble Ones perfected in mind, they clarify true Dhamma, shining forth and illuminating it, those light bringers, heroic sages, endowed with vision, dispelling faults, having heard their teaching, the wise with perfect understanding, by directly knowing the end of birth, come no more to renewal of being. And that's the thing. When you meditate and you see the truth, so in your meditation you really see the truth of things. This saddha, this conviction, faith, confidence in Buddha, confidence in the noble arahants, it really grows where you feel so much joy from their help, basically, their help out of this predicament. And you touch on their compassion, so much compassion, so much loving kindness, so much sympathetic joy, so much equanimity, that if you ask for help, it is there, that you really feel that what they teach you doesn't crumble. It doesn't crumble at your feet. And it really helps you to get out of the entire predicament, not just momentarily. I mean, that too, but definitely, ultimately, you get this sense that it's really possible. And so that's the thing with hearing true Dhamma. It should brighten the mind, gladden the mind, and there should be a sense of real appreciation and gratitude that it's still available to us, even in its limited form now. That noble arahants are the ones that are resurrecting the Dhamma. Many times we think it's us, but actually we don't know enough. We haven't practiced enough. Our knowledge is not complete. And so when you contemplate Buddha, noble arahants, all those in the realms, the pure abodes, that have that wisdom, that have perfected different aspects of the path, that they know really, really well. I mean, they've perfected the path in many sense, but there are also anagamis in those realms, and there's also many arahants. And what's said is that they're helping people. And so those are the real competent teachers of true Dhamma. So we need to heed that through the suttas and heed that in our practice. And so if you're interested in the Tayo Dhamma Sutta, so this was the sutta that talked about groupings of 3, what makes us incapable of realizing Nibbana and what makes us capable of realizing Nibbana. You understand that in both the unwholesome path, it has this link between associating with bad friends and then also around noble ones, not wanting to see them, not wanting to hear them. So that makes us incapable of realizing Nibbana because we're caught in wrong path and practice. But on the wholesome side, which is what this table shows us in terms of the groupings of 3, that if we abandon having bad friends, then ultimately it helps us to cultivate better habits, better tendencies, And so where we get to is we want to see noble ones and we want to hear the noble Dhamma. And so that's where it all ties in, that there is something deeply connected between noble ones, good company, as defined by the Buddha, and then hearing true Dhamma. In the Punabhasa Sutta, Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 10, discourse number 7, we hear this from a Yakini as well, that she says when she's listening to the Buddha, in this world your own child is dear, in this world your own husband is dear, but even greater than that is my love for this teaching's quest. For neither son nor husband, dear as they are, can free you from suffering, as listening to the true Dhamma frees living creatures from suffering. So there's a recognition even in that realm that listening to the Buddha, listening to the wise one, frees you from samsara, whereas this information is not available from one's dear ones, particularly if they don't know the method to free from suffering. And if I recall from this sutta, her son as well, when encouraged by the mother, was actually saying, yes, I'm listening too to this true Dhamma. So it's a very encouraging sutta. But there are challenges, even with true Dhamma. So if you recall the story of the Naga king, this is in the Dhammapada, and it's verse number 182. And the Buddha actually says, difficult it is to gain a human birth, difficult is the life of mortals, difficult is the opportunity to hear true Dhamma, difficult is the arising of a Buddha. And if you remember this story, the Naga king was waiting for a Buddha to arise, and so he sent his daughter out into the mortal world and set up a situation so that there were questions that she asked and the answers would enable the Naga king to ascertain whether a Buddha had arrived, because only the answer to those questions would indicate that a Buddha had arisen. And when you understand his story, this Naga king, you realize that the opportunity to hear Dhamma even at that time was quite difficult, particularly when a Buddha is not around and many, many years after the Buddha has passed. And so there are people in different realms or beings in different realms that are waiting for the arising of a Buddha, because it's a tremendous blessing to hear from such a noble being. So when you look at it 2,000, almost 600 years after the Buddha, we are at a point where Dhamma has declined. The Buddha had said it would decline 500 years after the Buddha, and now we're almost 2,600 years after the Buddha. So it's very difficult to find the true teachings, that they're getting lost, they're getting blurred. And when you think about how is that happening, it's because they get blended, because they get subverted, because people no longer recite the actual words, so the meaning gets lost. People don't remember, they don't raise up the Buddha's actual teaching. Instead, they prefer to create new things. And they think that that is what is important. And from their perspective, they have justification for that, that it's now modern times and so on and so forth. So from their perspective, it's justified. But when you walk the Noble Eightfold Path, you realize that even what's left of the Buddha's teaching is enough to help you along the way, for you to enter the stream and potentially to finish off the path. But you need some help. But the thing is that when you look at what's available and you follow what is in the instructions, the insight pathways, the detail of how the Buddha has cautioned and how he has encouraged, realize it's very important to preserve that. And it's very important to not allow it to decline some more, because for the rest of those that are in the world, what will be left for them? So we must practice as much as possible what is true Dhamma, and to make sure we practice what the Buddha has really taught. And the question that always comes up is, how come true Dhamma doesn't last long? And this was a question that was asked even at the time of the Buddha in a number of suttas. So you have the Kimila Sutta, which is Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 7, discourse number 59. And you have Saddhamma Patirupaka Sutta, which is Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 16, discourse number 13. And one particular answer he gives, and this is specifically from the Kimila Sutta, but it's also reflected in the other sutta. And it says, there is the case where when a Tathagata has become totally unbound, the monks, nuns, male lay followers and female lay followers live without respect, without deference for the teacher, live without respect, without deference for the Dhamma, and then also for the Sangha, and also for the training, and also towards concentration, heedfulness. They live without respect, without deference for hospitality. So all those things. This is the cause, this is the reason why when a Tathagata has become totally unbound, the true Dhamma does not last a long time. So this is something that we can all understand right now, that when monks and nuns, male lay followers, female lay followers, when we don't live with respect towards Buddha Dhamma Sangha, towards the training, towards concentration, towards heedfulness, towards generosity, hospitality, then Dhamma starts to decline. And so you see that happening. You see that when people don't keep precepts, when people don't have respect towards Buddha, they actually turn away from the Buddha's teachings. They say, you don't need that. That's old stuff. And they say many different permutations of saying that. And so they carve out all the things. We looked at this in the First Noble Truth of Suffering, that when you carve out karma and rebirth, that's another way that we do it. When we don't train in the Noble Eightfold Path, but we train in just one aspect of the Noble Eightfold Path, just on mindfulness, then you don't get the whole development, as the Buddha has taught. Development of the body, development of the mind, development of virtue, development of wisdom. And so that's why it doesn't last for a long time. When we get very negligent with the path and we don't attend to it correctly. But the opposite is true when we do attend to it. When monks, nuns, male and female lay followers, when we do take refuge in Buddha Dhamma Sangha in a very authentic sense, we really understand what that means, when we have the practice for ourselves that is cultivating true insight, true concentration, that we're not negligent, we're actually quite vigilant, and we have a lot of respect for hospitality. So it's important to take this Dhamma into our minds and to reflect on how we actually practice, what we're actually doing. Because we can't change what's happening in the world, but we can change what we're doing towards this Dhamma itself. And there's a few parts in the Saddhamma Patirupaka Sutta, which is very similar to the previous Kimila Sutta, but it goes on a little more. And so when the question it is that has been asked about rules, training rules for monks and nuns, when it says, why are there more training rules, but fewer bhikkhus in this case, establishing the final knowledge, then the Buddha answers it by saying, when beings are deteriorating and true Dhamma is disappearing, there are more training rules, but fewer bhikkhus are established in final knowledge. The true Dhamma does not disappear so long as a counterfeit of the true Dhamma has not arisen in the world. But when a counterfeit of the true Dhamma arises in the world, then the true Dhamma disappears. Just as Kassapa, gold does not disappear so long as counterfeit gold has not arisen in the world. But when counterfeit gold arises, then true gold disappears. So the true Dhamma does not disappear so long as a counterfeit of the true Dhamma has not arisen in the world. But when a counterfeit of true Dhamma arises in the world, then the true Dhamma disappears. It is not the earth element, Kassapa, that causes the true Dhamma to disappear, nor the water element, nor the heat element, nor the air element. It is the senseless people who arise right here who cause the true Dhamma to disappear. So that packs a real punch, that when counterfeit true Dhamma appears, so things like fake Dhamma quotes, fake Buddha quotes, from that end of the spectrum all the way to things that totally subvert the Buddha Dhamma, to blended Dhamma. This is like when you're mixing gold, which is true Dhamma, with copper and silver and impurities really. You're mixing it, you're blending it. That's why it's very dangerous when you mix all these modern things that are coming with Buddha Dhamma and you're diluting essentially. And so Buddha is actually literally saying in this sutta to Kassapa that it goes down, it starts to disappear, and that's where we're at. That when there is the counterfeit stuff, when there is the stuff that was available at the Buddha times, it starts to blend eternalism with what the Buddha's teaching, and then you dilute that Nibbana is the only truth. You get to this point. And so it's very difficult for us to find true Dhamma at times. And what we must do is ensure that we know what the Buddha actually taught and to practice that. And it is increasingly difficult that outside of all this thing around modern science and all the things that kind of mix up the Buddha's teaching in a samsaric sense, you get Buddha Dhamma that's labeled as Buddha Dhamma, but it actually emphasizes the wrong thing. It misapprehends the true meaning of the Buddha's teaching, takes you down the wrong path. And so it's quite precarious. You need to ensure that you know what the Buddha's teachings are, because otherwise someone tells you something and you realize 10 years later, wow, that's eternalism view. Why was I cultivating that for 10 years? Or that's a nihilistic. So how can you enter the stream when you have these wrong views? And so that's the danger of right now, that there is dilution of the Buddha's teachings. And so you mix all these impurities with true Dhamma. And so when Buddha says at the end, it is the senseless people who arise right here, well, he's talking about sappurisa sevana. At the worst, he's talking about foolish people, which he calls balas, the fools. And so when you think about, and this is not personal, when you look at newsreaders, people that are acting, people that are being in advertisements, people that are influencers, these people are not walking the Noble Eightfold Path. So in many ways they fall into that category of senseless people. Then you have the people that are practicing the wrong path, but they're lay teachers or they're in robes, and unfortunately they're also what Buddha would call senseless people, because at that point they're actually encouraging hundreds if not thousands of people down the wrong path. And so these people, upon the breakup of the body after death, would still be roaming in samsara, maybe in a woeful realm, maybe in a woeful existence. And it's very, very difficult to see, to witness. The Buddha has a series of talks on samatha niyama, the fixed course of rightness, that which leads towards Nibbana. And the first set is in Anguttara Nikāya chapter 5, discourses 151 to 153. And he emphasizes that when we disparage the talk, disparage the speaker, disparage ourselves, these are blocks. Even if we're listening to true Dhamma, it blocks us from penetrating it. Same with if we have an unsettled mind, or we're not contemplating wisely, when we're unwise, stupid and obtuse, things like that. There's a whole list of things. But if we don't do that, then we're able to enter this samatha niyama, this fixed course of rightness, that we're steadying on the path towards Nibbana. So when we remove the blocks, when we contemplate more wisely, when we don't disparage, when we listen with a calm mind, all these sorts of things, it's very good for us. Then it penetrates. Then we can really see it for what it really is. Similarly, in Anguttara Nikāya, chapter 6, discourse number 86 to 88, it's a similar thing, again around samatha niyama. And the Buddha talks about being obstructed by kamma, being obstructed by defilement, being obstructed by vipaka kamma, the result of our actions, lacking conviction, lacking saddha. And so there's a whole list of things like having very unwholesome conduct, and then having these unwholesome wishes like not wanting to listen, not lending an ear, misapprehending the meaning, all these things. And so when we overcome those blocks, that we're in a better position to actually understand, to better penetrate the true teachings. And so if you offline look at some of these suttas, take that Dhamma into your mind and reflect, do I have any of these things when I read the suttas, when I do the meditations, when I try and understand, when I'm listening to a talk? Then these are the things that you can overcome. When you know that they are there, when you admit to that, then you overcome by acknowledging it and then making a determination to say, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be open, willing to be instructed, willing to attend to that which is difficult, but which is the truth. To have that ultimate intention, inclination, I really want to know the truth. It's like the advice when you're doing the death contemplation and you're finding it difficult and you say, I really, really want to know. I know I have blocks, but I really, really want to know. And it's the same thing with true Dhamma. But that when you're really a seeker of the truth, that you understand this is such a bad deal, that what I'm experiencing in this human existence, not just during the bad times, but even during the good times, when you see the process of aging, when you see the process of sickness, when you see the process of death, of those that you love, of those that you're acquainted with, knowing it's your predicament as well, then you make that wholehearted intention to say, I really want to hear the truth. Even if it's very difficult, please show me. Please show me in the meditation. And then when you actually see it, when you follow those instructions in the meditation, you really see it, you feel so grateful, so appreciative, and so joyful to be blessed with that. And so when you come to the path, this is what this hearing the true Dhamma is really about. And to understand that at each and every turn, our daily life, our meditation, we need to ensure that we don't transform what we're doing on the path and turning satcha, truth, saddhamma, turning the true teaching into musa dhamma. And to preserve what is true, guard it. That is something that's very true for us. We need to preserve the truth, guard it, have a strong intention. So this intention about truth is really satcha adhitthana. We make a determination for truth, satcha adhitthana. This helps us to overcome the floods. So I'll leave the talk here. Let's share the merit with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy and well. May all beings be free from suffering. Blessings of the Triple Gem. Wishing you all well. Teruan Saranai.